So I've been asked to talk about social responsibility and hydropower, which is based on previous research funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation within a huge research program. My name is WernerHediger. I'm with the Center for Economic Policy Research at the University of Applied Science of the Grisons. That's in the southeast corner of Switzerland. And I'm also board member of the Alpine Energy Research Center in in the same canton, in the same region. So what I will be presenting today is the result of a pit stop we did after completing that research program, looking for where are the pressing problems for investors and policy design. Also, the research is very much based on what we needed to develop for Swiss policy advice. I will try to give you a generic insight and then give some background information on the situation in Switzerland. Let me start with the motivation and background. Hydropower is important for sustainable development in many countries. It is a major pillar of the energy systems. It's renewable, CO2-free, and a local energy source. So it's key for the energy transition and for sustainable development, as it has important economic and social impacts. It has been important for economic and social development and is important in many places, especially in mountain alpine areas, but it also has negative environmental impacts. So having these three spheres, we need an evaluation from a sustainable development perspective. We also observe a divergence between the corporate and the societal concerns, and particularly in Europe with currently low electricity prices on the European market, low returns on investment, which makes that we do not have sufficient investors in the needed energy or hydropower projects. So having these societal and corporate concerns, we have to address issues of corporate social responsibility, of governance, private and public governance, and since we're dealing with a natural resource, also the distribution of the resource rights. Before starting with that, we need to be aware that the whole structure of our energy systems, particularly the hydropower-based energy systems, are a political and economic issues which has been based on historical developments. In the Alps, hydropower was a key factor for early industrialization. This has resulted in the current industrial organization structures with many local monopolies. And this is to be observed and characterized today by the particular ownership structures we have. On the one side, we have the owners and shareholders of hydropower and energy companies and plants. Then we have the owners of water resource rights. In Switzerland, for instance, the cantons are by constitution the owners of the water resources. And this results in a particular situation and pressure for policy. And last but not least, we have the holders of the water concessions, the water use rights or hydropower concessions. That's an issue which has been and currently is still discussed on the European level, EU level, how this how we should continue with granting concessions for hydropower plants. When talking about the concessions, granting concessions, it's an issue of royalties, how they shall be distributed. And all these aspects on the right-hand side need to be integrated in a coherent framework. And the numbers here indicate how I will proceed, start with CSR and end with the governance issues. So, first, hydropower activities, what we observe, must increasingly be evaluated from a sustainable development perspective. And corporate social responsibility, CSR, is the business equivalent to sustainable development that has been defined on the global and national level. It involves a shift from a pure shareholder perspective, aiming at maximizing profits and corporate value, towards a broader concept of multi-stakeholder concerns and stakeholder values. Let's have a look on some definitions or interpretations we can find in the literature. First, clearly, corporate social responsibility is the business contribution and commitment to sustainable development, such as emphasized by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the OECD, amongst other institutions. And then for me, two path-breaking articles in the academic literature. In a special issue of the Geneva Papers on Risk, Geoffrey Hill emphasized that CSR is about reducing externalized costs and avoiding distributional conflicts. And in the same issue, Andrea Beltrati wrote a famous sentence saying that socially responsible firms try to maximize profits and at the same time to improve the welfare of other stakeholders. For an economist, this sounds familiar indeed. It corresponds to Wang's definition, a formal approach and conception of Pareto improvement, that is, making someone better off without harming anybody else. And in the first paper on CSR, I translated this into a Paretian view of the firm. And this was based on formal mathematical approaches towards the concept of CSR, starting from this definition, that CSR is to be understood as a program of action where a firm's objective is to maximize its corporate value, that's the long-term perspective, and at the same time to contribute to an improvement of social welfare. And when I presented this first in a conference, the convener then at the Copenhagen Business School told me, I never believed before that we can define CSR in mathematical terms, but now I know it's feasible. But I will not show you any equations because time is too short. This definition, an approach towards social welfare, socioeconomic approach, needs that we address the externalities in the form of external effects, but also spillover effects that have an impact on social well-being, social welfare, and that in the long run have an impact on the reputation capital of the firm. So a firm doing good, generating positive externalities, will have an increase in reputation capital. A negative sign will have a negative impact on its reputation. On this background, we can define corporate value as a function of distributed profits or resource rents, plus the valued changes of the physical and reputation capital of that firm. So that's the business part. Now let's move to the sustainable development and societal side of the medal, so to say. First, sustainable development is a dynamic concept. It's not a fixed state of harmony, as the Brundtland Commission underlined in its 1987 book. This involves a continuous evaluation of trade-offs among the different economic, social, and environmental system goals or spheres, as Ed Barbie underlined in the same year already. And for me, that involves that we can sustainable development usefully formalize in a social welfare function. And when doing that, we achieve an implicit monetary evaluation because we have monetary and non-monetary factors in this function. And this implicit monetary evaluation is on the one side based on the measurement of the impacts a firm's activities have on society, on social welfare, in the economic sphere, environmental and social sphere. And at the same time, we need to use societal or stakeholder values given to these impacts. And we can use this or develop an approach which we call an integrated sustainability assessment, which combines these two perspectives: a standard sustainability assessment approach on the impacts or impact assessment and stakeholder values through a stakeholder involvement and dialogue. That's where we can start with. Now let's move to the problem of distribution and thus towards governance. The corporate social responsibility is the commitment of the firms towards sustainable development. So we need to look at resource rents, how they are generated and distributed, and how they impact the total value of hydropower. First, the resource rent or net revenue of a business activity. This rent can be shared in form of profits, both retained for future investments or distributed to the shareholders, to taxes paid to different authorities, like federal, cantonal, or municipal authorities in Switzerland, the royalties that must be paid to the owners of the hydropower rights. In Switzerland, those are called water fees. Now let's move to CSR. When we look on the right-hand side, we have here the impacts in the different spheres on the regional economy, including wages paid to the employees, on social and environmental impact, capital. And these aspects that can be evaluated from an integrated sustainability assessment perspective, those issues have an impact, as said before, on reputational capital. So that's how we link the whole story of CSR towards sustainable development and the resource rent, the hydropower activities. Now, the next step is to distinguish between the private or internal value, that's the left side with the profits and reputation capital, and the external value of hydropower, which involves all the externalities and distributional impacts, including the taxes and the royalties that are delivered to the public or to the stakeholders. Both together constitute the total value of hydropower, which must be approached in form of a net present value. And having this elaborated in mathematical form, we can show that we must reasonably invest in hydropower if the total value of hydropower is positive. Thus, even if, as we observe in many cases, the private or internal value is negative, investments are reasonable if the external value overcompensates the negative sign of the private value. So the total value of hydropower is important. With that, I can come to a conclusion. CSR can usefully be formalized as a constrained optimization problem of Pareto improvement and capital accumulation, including reputational capital, which makes the link towards social welfare. This formal approach allows us to assess the opportunity cost of a firm's voluntary and or enforced commitment to CSR, to sustainable development, and to improve the well-being of other people. By doing this, it implies externally determined accounting prices that must express stakeholder values, individual preferences, and community values, as well as risk premiums that are relevant for the anticipation of irreversible or potentially irreversible changes. Thus, CSR involves externalities that influence the reputational capital of the firm, but also distributional concerns. And when we talk about these distributional issues, we need to have a closer look on the royalties and the governance of the companies of hydropower at large. And that's the next step. So just to repeat, investments realize a project whenever the total value is positive, even if the private value, which is the return on investment to those financing the project, is positive. So the total value must be positive. As we are in a transition from a former state-owned monopolies toward more market opening and liberalization, one recommendation is also the public hand, the federal or cantonal entities, as well as philanthropists, who care about societal values of hydropower might have to play an important role as investors in hydropower, especially when the returns on investment are low, as we currently observe. They could sell them again on the stock market in a later period. Thus, we need to do the next step, which involves discussions of royalties or water fees and concessions in an integrated approach, which must involve the governance and the ownership structure of hydropower companies and the fiscal incidence that goes along with these decisions, as we have fiscal incidence coming from the royalties in a federalistic state. As remarked in the beginning, we need to integrate all these issues in a coherent framework. And just give you some insights about the situation in Switzerland. If you look here in the north, the blue dots are the run-of-river power plants, and you see in the southern part, in the Alps, where we have the location of the storage and pump storage plants, and where the majority of the hydropower production is located. The last look on governance issues. In the left map, we see the ownership structure, the main ownerships by cantons in Swiss hydropower. And just be aware that lowland cantons, that's the cantons in the north of the country, and cities there hold 56% of the shares in hydropower companies by 2018, but also the mountain cantons and some municipalities have been holding 16%. Neighboring countries, that was mainly EDF, Électricité de France, in 2018, being responsible for slightly more than 10%. And then we have private and institutional investors who had with 10%. That's the one side. And you see the discrepancy. On the right side, we have the main recipients of the water fees, of the royalty revenues in 2016. Those are the mountain cantons, mainly the canton of Valais and the Grisons. And that explains why we have such burning policy problems. On the first, low electricity prices, low returns investments, no investors for hydropower projects that are important for the energy strategy. Second, the revision of the water fee system in Switzerland is still pending, exactly because this discrepancy between ownership in hydropower companies and on the water rights. And last but not least, most of the hydropower concessions must be renewed in the coming decades. And if we want to be successful, we need to integrate these three burning problems. With that, I conclude and say thank you for your attention. And if you have questions, you can send emails, and I could also provide some equations on separate slides.